Okay, here we are with Michael Birchall, Curator of Public Practice at Tate Liverpool. Michael is the first resident of our residency project at Medialab PRado. And after 4 intensive days of talks and meetings with practitioners, agents, collectives, and all kinds of people, we have now the occasion to talk a bit more in depth with Michael about his practice and his vision about collaborative arts in general. And maybe in this sense, we could start directly with the first straightforward question, Michael. What is actually the job that you're doing at Tate Liverpool? Which are the skills necessary for accomplishing this job in a satisfactory way?
Yeah, so I'm Michael Birchall. I'm Curator of Public Practice at Tate Liverpool. I suppose it's important, first of all, to say that public practice is quite a new term in the United Kingdom. It's one that's been used quite a lot in the United States to define practices that engage the public that aren't necessarily about learning or pedagogical-led works. So in my role, I produce projects that encompass artists and publics, broadly speaking, and this is usually outside of the so-called exhibitionary framework, which is, one of the conventional places where curators execute their work. And as part of this role, I'm also interested in producing new work. So next year we have a socially engaged artwork, which is part of a CAPP network that we're working on. And I also am producing some performance series. And also as an academic in post, I'm also working around the idea of academic research and knowledge exchange in the museum. So part of my job is also at the university, and I very much link the university element into the museum context. But your question about skills is always a difficult one, really, to answer. But I guess the fundamental skill of any curator really is effective communication. So I think part of my role is to communicate ideas, concepts, and broadly speaking, art practices to many different audiences and publics. And that's a skill that all curators have to do, whether or not you're giving a talk to a bunch of artists or to a group of people who are going around the museum. I think negotiation is another sort of concept that I work around a lot, not just in negotiating with other people or partners, but also in negotiating one's own ideas or concepts, because often you have to make compromises in the projects that you deliver, depending on the audiences that you engage with or a range of practices that you produce. I would say those are the main skills attached to the job, but I could go on. I mean, I think being a accountant is another one which would be quite useful at times, which I'm not really very good at, but I think there are a range of skills that contemporary curators employ in their work, which are far beyond even the term curator doesn't really encompass a lot of these skills, which we're now increasingly using in our jobs.
Actually, do you think it is possible to open up an arts institution by collaborative arts projects?
Well, I work at Tate Liverpool, so it's one of the 4 Tate sites that we have: Tate Britain, Tate Modern, Tate St Ives, and Tate Liverpool. So I think that means that we're not in a London context, so there's certain things that we can do at Tate Liverpool that perhaps would be more tricky to execute in London, given the scale of the region which we're in. But as we're in the northwest of England, we really present a program to the whole northwest, but also to a national and even international audience of visitors that come to the museum to see our collection, which we have on show all year round, and also to see our exhibitions that we rotate several times during the year. But the idea of opening up the institution is a difficult sort of way to respond to this notion of museums being closed, because by saying opening up, you're already telling me that the museum is closed, and I think we're actually not closed. So I think it's not so much as the sort of concept of opening up the museum, but it's about us allowing for dialogues with several different kinds of audiences, or as we say, constituents within this idea of a program that we deliver. I think this also is part of our approach, in that the program that we deliver to our audiences encompasses many different elements. So we have some audiences that come just to see a collection show. We have some that buy a ticket to see a special exhibition, such as Yves Klein, which we have on show right now. At the same time, we have audiences that drop in for one-off events or activities, which we're maybe doing on, once in the week, or maybe this is part of a sort of long-term project. I think this sort of variety of offerings that we have to our audiences means that we allow for this dialogue to emerge across a spectrum of artistic activity. I think also, if I look back historically at Tate Liverpool and its sort of inception, Tate Liverpool had always distinguished itself from other Tate sites in that it always wished to engage with audiences first and foremost above other things. So when Tate Liverpool first opened, there were mediators, there was a huge sort of educational push, because it was the first time that this collection was coming out of London and being shown in the north of England. So I think that the ethos of Tate Liverpool from the 80s onwards is still very much prevalent. So we're still interested in doing projects that engage a diverse range of audiences. A good example would be we have an upcoming project called Tate Exchange, and Tate Exchange is a project that's happening in London at Tate Modern. At Tate Modern, it's an entire floor. It's level 5 of the new extension of Tate Modern, and in Tate Liverpool, we've taken out part of our collection constellations, as we call them, and we have a room or a space which is an exchange space. So Tate Exchange allows for an exchange with audiences. Part of the program is done so-called in-house by various curators, including learning and exhibitions and displays curators. And we also have, what's crucial to this is a pretty extensive programmed by our associates. Now these associates are organisations, artist collective groups, charities that have had a long association with Tate Liverpool over more or less a almost 30-year period, so a really a long time of engagement. And this allows them to come into the museum context and present a work, do a project, do a workshop, do a range of activities. And I think that even the title Exchange means that Tate is having an exchange with our audiences. So this is really in its, in London it's been open for maybe a month now, and our exchange space opens the end of the month. So it's going to be interesting to see how these exchanges happen, and also what this means for the institution, because I think we're taking an immense risk by allowing essentially part of the program to be initiated by our associates, but this is also entrusting of us to, as you say, open up the institution.
In this context of opening up an institution by collaborative arts projects, I wonder if it's actually possible to do this by long-term or short-term projects within this collaborative area.
That's a good question. I'm interested in both forms of project making. When I conceptualize my practice or my program, I try and conceive this around the shaping of an exhibition program. But as a public practice program, this means that one specific theme or concept might have a series of iterations or manifestations over a period of time. This is in a way a long-term project. So now I have a series on, it's called Art on the Margins on the Crisis of Overproduction. And the first phase is a series of talks and lectures. The second phase will be something else. But it's taking this idea of a holistic program and using this in a long-term way. But I'm also interested in this short-term idea to sort of do bursts of activity that respond or relate to specific needs. At the same time, as a curator, it's a real luxury these days to be able to do long-term projects. I think we're all sort of committed to delivering program, but really long-term projects in over a course of years are incredibly hard to do. Really, I think it would be lovely at a certain point to engage in a socially engaged project that took place over a long period of time, and I've only been witness to such projects. In the context of Liverpool, we have the Assemble piece, which won the Turner Prize, set in the Granby streets. That's a sort of long-term, socially engaged commission, and I think, I don't know if this is possible now in the sort of, in the way perhaps any institution operates, in that it has to deliver program and this has to change. But I very much like the idea of engaging in projects or concepts over a duration. I think obviously if we think about a sort of academic model of durational performance, then this is something that I'm very much interested in my work.
So when you're actually dealing with a local group, is it actually possible to create a short-term project, or does the preparation and the necessity of gaining a certain confidence with the group and the collective actually need a lot of time?
I think it depends on the nature of the project, really. I think if we're talking specifically about collaborative projects, which I think we are, a short-term project, it depends how you define short-term, but you really have to build those relationships with those communities, with those groups. And for example, in the context of the project that we're producing next spring with Christopher Klein, at the moment we're having conversations around community groups we're going to engage with. These partnerships have been sort of managed and worked on over a period of years, in that we as an organisation have had a relationship with these organisations to work alongside them, work with them in working on a programme. I think the short-term sort of dropping in, dropping out, almost, let's say the term parachuting artist model, isn't always possible, because you just need time to sort of engage in that group. I mean, if we're thinking short term, like a couple of weeks, you as an artist or as a curator working in a new context, you have to really drop in and engage on what's going on here. I mean, if I think of the context of this residency, which I'm part of here, I've met so many people in this first part of the residency, but certainly I haven't immersed myself into the context of the Madrid art scene. So I hope that answers your question.
In this context, I think it's important it's interesting to talk about what you coined as poverty aesthetics. Maybe you can comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term that I used probably today was poverty aesthetics, and I think that is a dangerous territory, really, where an artist or a group wants to engage with a group that is not doing so well in order to develop a series of works. And I think there's a real danger there if you engage in collaborative art, that you're conscious about an audience that you engage with or a community group, and you're not merely fabricating an identity from their locale into an art project because they're essentially poor. I think there have been examples of this in the past. I think there are certainly projects that have worked in this manner. I think there's also a distinction to be drawn here between socially engaged artists that engage in the social and other artists that feature the social in their practice but are not engaged. And so I think that's perhaps where there's a danger of this happening. But you mentioned this sort of collective model, or working with collectives. I think this is also perhaps a bit controversial for institutions, in that if you work with a collective, a defined collective, then you're working with a pretty established community ties and connections. And so, one has to be aware of that if one wants to engage in a specific context. And this also goes back to this idea of the parachuting in artist or curator, in that going into this community context means that you have to have an awareness of what you're about to encounter. And I think if we consider that curators such as me and the position that I have, we as we don't care for collections anymore, essentially we care for communities, or we care for locales. So when artists come, or when we want to develop projects in the social realm, we should have access to that and an awareness and an understanding in order to sort of develop projects. But this is also, I think, where this concept of co-production emerges, that we don't merely produce projects with people, but that they're co-produced between an artist, and a curator and a community group or a constituent in that, and there's a sort of sharing of ideas. I think, again, this project that we're doing next spring, which is a musical, we need people who participate in this need to bring their own expertise as amateur actors, singers, dancers, musicians. They also will enrich the musical, the story, and the context of the piece. Without their participation, the artist wouldn't really be able to engage in the work.
And so, to conclude, maybe a question. When we're talking so much about the different groups, the different collectives that all work together within one big project, and everybody bringing something of its own in the whole project, is it actually possible to have a manual of style, a replicable model that can be actually used for creating a standard of procedure of creating collaborative art projects?
A model, or maybe even a manual, you could say. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I was talking about this the other day with someone at our CAPP meeting, actually, and I was thinking about examples that have been emerged in the last few years. So there's Pablo Helguera wrote a book called Education for Socially Engaged Art, which is not really a manual, but it's more of a sort of description of a variety of contexts for collaboration, which is a good example. But then looking back towards the 70s and the 80s in the United Kingdom, where we had a strong community art presence, there were manuals that were produced then, which are quite actually useful in terms of their radicality and their use of community and engagement. But I suppose at this stage, in terms of the social turn in art, which is certainly what we're in now, I'm not sure if one could produce a manual that would encapsulate a variety of processes. But I think it would be possible to make an attempt to sort of work on this. And I think you could do this you'd have to pick a series of projects and initiatives as exemplars in order to explain a variety of contexts. But I'm not really sure if this would encapsulate such a wide area of practice. It's a bit like saying, is there a manual for contemporary art? And there are obviously there are manuals that have emerged that talk about curatorial practice and talk about very conventional, even laborious processes to curating. But when it comes to art practice, it's so diverse, isn't it? I mean, you could write a whole book on negotiation in collaborative arts. I mean, you could. So I think maybe one could make an attempt to do it, or even like an A to Z as a sort of starting point.